This morning we'll be dealing with part of the fuel system. I've got a fuel filter from Toyota, an air filter from Nitto, and a fuel pump also from Japan. It's Century Fuel Pump, Konishi Manufacturing, Tokyo, Japan. I just love the logo on this. An angry man spitting lightning bolts. The first step is to remove the fuel cap and then put it back to release any pressure within the fuel tank. The fuel pump is electronic, so I'm disconnecting. Once the battery is disconnected, remove the coolant overflow reservoir. You want to keep it upright so you don't spill any of that coolant. Just remember, don't do anything that I do. Next, unplug the sensor on the side of the air filter box and then unclip the four corners of the box. Unscrew the clamp on the air hose, then slide it off and lift everything up to expose the air filter. The dirty old filter just lifts out and goes straight in the bin. I'll then use a 10mm socket to remove the 3 bolts holding down the base of the air filter box. It is filthy and will get a good clean. While that was drying, I took a wet cloth back to the engine bay. There's actually dust everywhere, even under the box, so I might as well wipe that down while it's accessible. Good grief, I've just realized after taking away the air filter box that the air intake hose that is supposed to connect to here and suck in air from outside the engine bay over here is non-existent. The missing air duct is essential if you want the engine to run on cooler air from outside the engine bay, so I hope I can find one. I popped down to the local scrapyard and I think I was extremely lucky to find this air intake part with the necessary bolt. It just needs a good clean, then will be as good as new. Thank goodness I'd taken the day off work, so I had time to sort out this missing part and it bolted in place perfectly. Moving back to the fuel filter, an LED lamp made things a bit more visible, including a spider which had nestled its way in there. A bit of penetrating oil was sprayed on the banjo bolt that sits on top of the fuel filter, and then a 17mm spanner was used to loosen it. Remove the 2 washers and the banjo bolt, then tuck the fuel line up and away. The flare fitting for the lower fuel hose unthreads with a 14mm spanner. You can't see anything but my hands here, so here is another example of how it unscrews. Unscrew the remaining 2 bolts with a 10mm wrench and then the old fuel filter comes out. The new fuel filter can now go in. Make sure the fuel lines are tight. You don't want leaking fuel and the possibility of a raging inferno. Once the 2 bolts are in, you can connect the upper fuel line. Remember to put new washers on either side of the upper fuel line as you connect the banjo bolt. The first part is done. Everyone loves a story that ends with a good twist. Filter your fuel, not your jokes. With the fuel filter installed, we can now move on to the air filter. The slightly cleaner base for the air filter box goes back in, and it now connects to an air duct. That will definitely make the engine happier. Also, the squeaky clean new air filter plonks on top. The air inlet hose is reconnected by tightening the clamp, and then the top of the air filter box can be reconnected with the clips, and don't forget the sensor on the side. With the air filter done, we'll move on to the fuel pump. It is conveniently located under one of the passenger seats. Use a Phillips screwdriver to undo the 4 screws and access the fuel tank below. unclamp two of the connecting hoses with some pliers and then slide them off. It's best to make sure the fuel tank is almost empty before doing this. Fuel is highly flammable and you could blow yourself up if you somehow ignited your fuel tank. The main fuel line disconnects with a 17mm spanner and some petrol will leak out. There are 8 small bolts holding down the fuel pump. I won't bore you with the entire process of unscrewing them. I did use penetrating oil on a few of them to get them undone. Be careful when removing the fuel pump assembly from the fuel tank. It needs to be twisted clockwise to allow room for the float to come out. You don't want to damage the float because then your fuel gauge is not going to work properly. Once the fuel pump assembly is out of the tank, it is easy to remove the old fuel pump and old strainer sock. Slide the 2 clamps on the connecting hose upwards with pliers and then pull on the base of the old fuel pump to disconnect it. Keep the rubber seal at the base aside and then empty any fuel inside the fuel pump into your tank. The last 2 connections are the 2 wires powering the pump. These can be undone with a screwdriver. Judging by that dirty old sock, this is the first time this has been changed. The fresh sock goes onto the new pump. Everybody likes fresh socks. Then there is one small detail to remember. There is a minuscule clip inside the Century fuel pump box. Be careful not to miss it. It goes on after the fuel strainer, as you can see in this illustration. And then the rubber seal goes on top of it. Once the rubber base is firmly in place, the new pump plugs in and goes back in exactly the same way as the old pump came out. The only other thing to mention is that the main fuel line should be connected last with your spanner and should be tight, obviously. Make sure the clamps are back on the hoses, screw the cover back on, and then sikadile. We are finished. Reconnect, power to the pump. Let's test out this pump. Idling nicely at 1000 RPM. Okay, I'm gonna pop the bonnet and check for leaks. The fuel is flowing.